Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome along to the University of Glasgow. My name is Graham Roy, and I'm Dean of External Engagement here in the College of Social Sciences at the University of Glasgow, and it's great to have such a fantastic turnout for the event today. Just leaves me to do some quick housekeeping, so there is no planned fire alarm today. If there is a fire alarm, the fire exit is over to the back door there, and the meeting area is out in front of the main building. So, without further ado, let's get started. I'm delighted to introduce Richard Davies from University of Bristol, who is Director of the Economic Observatory, who will kick off the event today. Richard.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the University of Glasgow. Welcome to the Economics Observatory's first ever in-person event. This brought to you in conjunction with the Government Economics Service and also, of course, the University of Glasgow. We were set up during the kind of teeth of the COVID crisis to try and provide evidence, academically grounded evidence that would help policymakers take decisions that affect all of our lives. We were set up during COVID, but we've evolved to move on to other topics, and none is more important, clearly, at the moment than the environment. First thing for me to do, other than to welcome you, is to thank some people. So in particular, Anton Muscatelli and Graham Roy, professors here at the university who are our hosts, but also the team that have put it together, in particular, Linda, Stuart, Katie, and John. We are also launching today the second issue of Eco magazine, which you all should have a copy of. Today is Finance Day, formally, here at COP. And the magazine has articles affecting all different aspects of the economy, so from extreme weather to deforestation in sub-Saharan Africa to the promises that countries have made and how we can hold them to account. At the observatory, and also particularly with the magazine, we're trying to do something different, and we would love your feedback on it. In this magazine you will find, and I think this is unlike anything else in economics, both the cutting-edge evidence but then also interviews with people who have been affected by this in their daily lives, so on-the-ground experts. And we hope that makes for a good mix. Final two things to say. The first is really a personal one, which is an admission. So I, like most of the people in this room, I imagine, have spent too little of my working life on this topic. So I've been focused on things like inflation, the financial crisis, Brexit. And editing this magazine and putting this event together has been a complete eye-opener to me. And three things jump out. The first is how bad things are. Take a look at the charts in this magazine. Most of them, as we would say, are going off the scale. The melting of glaciers, for example. The second is that it affects all of us. So all of the things I've been working on, trade, inflation, financial crises, the authors in this magazine tell us that you can't really make sense of those things properly unless you think about the environment. And the third is that policy matters. So there are pieces in there which really show different policy decisions have different effects. And finally, just to say a word about this city. So Glasgow is a city that I have argued is the most interesting in the UK and potentially in the entire Western advanced world, and one that we can learn from. And that's because 120 years ago, no city was more popular. No city was more innovative. No city was more advanced when it came to art, theatre, the city's underground system. It wasn't the first in the world, but it was the best in the world. And of course, science and engineering. But yet, over the next 60 years, in industry, in housing, in the environment, the city's story was one of loss, one of losing these incredible peaks that it had achieved. And the fact that Glasgow is today bouncing back and is the great city that many of you study in shows us both the failings and the successes that policy really matters. And that is the whole point of the Economics Observatory. And with that in mind, I'm very excited to hand over to our first chair, Gary Gillespie.
Okay, thank you very much, Richard. Just check you can hear me okay, yeah? Okay, thanks. It's a pleasure to be here today and to chair this opening session. As Richard said, my name's Gary Gillespie. I'm the Chief Economic Advisor within the Scottish Government, so I'm here with a Government Economic Service hat, alongside being a proud Glaswegian. also been a student of Glasgow University at one time in the past as well. So it's great to have this event within Glasgow at the time when we've got COP26 just less than a mile away from here being there. I managed to be in the Blue Zone yesterday, and there's a real expectation and buzz of excitement around the opportunities there to really make a change and a significant difference. So my role today is just to chair this session. We've got 3 excellent speakers, and we'll come to them in a second, and they'll give us 10 minutes each roughly on the economics of net zero, and then we'll open up for a panel discussion. I mean, if I can just say a little bit about Scotland maybe first. So we're committed to net zero by 2045. We have an annual plan in terms of how we progress that, which we report to Parliament. We've got commitments to reduce emissions by 75% by 2030. We have particular challenges, like all advanced economies, around agriculture, heat, decarbonising transport, how we do more in the circular economy, and how we deal with the challenges of nature and biodiversity as well. So we're keen to be part of the solution and keen to lead on that. We also have carbon industries in Scotland as well with the North Sea. So we have a number of challenges, opportunities, and part of my work at the moment within the government is looking at how we deliver a 10-year plan for national strategy for economic transformation. If you think of the amount of change that's going to happen over the next 10 years. So policy is really important, and we've got 3 great speakers today. So I'm going to start off with our first speaker, who's sitting to my left, is Valerie McCall, who's the manager of the Climate Policy Initiative, and Valerie will give us a perspective from him. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
They'll probably turn it on. They'll put it on, yeah.
I don't think it's open. Maybe I can use yours.
Yeah, no bother.
Okay, so thank you very much. And good afternoon, everyone. And thanks for having me here in this critical time for action. As an Italian from Sicily, we experienced firsthand the reasons of the sense of urgency that we all facing here at COP. As you know, like a few weeks ago, there's been a Mediterranean hurricane impacting the east coast of Sicily, causing floods and causing, as a consequence, disaster and also few deaths. So it's a new tropical reality that is entirely new for the island I am from, but we need to start to get used to. So before trying to do an initial introduction to the topics, I just wanted to tell you a little bit more about the Climate Policy Initiative, the organization I'm from. We're a team of analysts and advisors that work to improve energy and land use policies around the world with a particular focus on finance. I've been working for the organization for around 10 years, focusing in particular on effectiveness of policies and financial instruments, innovation, as well as more recently Paris alignment and the net zero challenge that we're all facing. Let me start to give you maybe an overview of the current status. At the beginning of the opening remarks, we already highlighted some of the graphs that are also included into this review are dramatic, and I just want to tell you a little bit more the financial perspective. So every year we publish a report which is called the Global Landscape for Climate Finance, where we track the level of investment that is flowing into low carbon, climate resilient activities. We were able in this last issue to track around 600 billion of investment going to the climate sector. This is an increase of 10% with respect to flows identified the previous year, a little bit lower year-to-year increase with respect to what observed previously, which was a 25% increase, but nevertheless a progress. We passed the 600 billion threshold, but the question is this nearly enough? We did a literature review of figures that we could compare our estimates with, and the investment needs are way higher. They're around 5 to 11 trillion per year through to 2050 in order to stabilize temperature to 2 degrees Celsius, which is 10 times more what is currently being invested. And this gives you a sense of the measure of the scale of the challenge we have in front of us. And the challenge is also not only about increasing the level of investment in low carbon, climate resilient finance, it's also about the challenge to stop harmful finance and investment as well. We did a study at the end of last year focusing on energy sector, while renewable energy investment managed to reach 300 billion. This is offset by fossil fuel subsidies, which the IMF estimated being like 6 trillion only in 2020, while at the same time investment in fossil fuel energy still continues with 130 billion. Investment is lower than what flows to renewable energy, but nevertheless this is a new capacity with long lifetime ahead that gets locked in to the energy system for a long time, and more than offset all the efforts done in mitigating climate change through renewable energy finance. So what are the barriers and the opportunities that for policy making? One of the key barriers has been for many years the lack of a robust regulatory framework. There is a lack of positive signal to the markets that lead to inefficiency in the response of public actors that do not know what priorities are, inefficiency on the side of private actors that respond then sluggishly to the challenge, being their lack of incentives forward. So what the government should do there is, of course, revert the trend, adopt taxonomies, and mandating disclosure that can help making financial actors aware of the risks, whether physical or transition risks that they're exposed to, and enable them to incorporate them into their investment decision making. Governments also need to green their own behaviors, phasing out fossil fuel, as I mentioned before, but also into incorporating carbon taxes that are able to give a price to the cost of inaction. In the study that I mentioned before on the energy sector, we saw that it's actually public institutions, to our surprise, that are investing the highest share of the investment into the energy sector into fossil fuel. It was particularly state-owned enterprises and export credit agencies being the ones pushing the most in their energy investment for fossil fuel. Then a second challenge is mobilizing the trillions of available capital that sits below the private sector. This means addressing risks and barriers, whether real or perceived that at the moment is holding investment from happening at scale. The barriers can be country-specific, can have to do with sovereign risk, can have to do with currency risk. They can be also technology-specific. Think about the risk of drilling a new well in the geothermal sector, or the risk of perceived underperformance of energy efficiency equipment. The solution there is to support through the public sector, development financing institutions, the coverage of such specific risks and barriers that really are slowing down investment. Is something that also Draghi mentioned recently at the G20. There is a strong potential in effective use of public investment if this investment can address the barriers that can then unleash the finance from the private actors. But this needs to familiarize with the new risk models, be open to innovative financial instrument, and then looking towards like blended finance initiatives with both with the public actor covers the risk that the private sector is not willing to bear. And an example of work that CPI has done in this space is through the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance, which is this initiative that we've been running for about 7 years now. And it's really aiming at identifying innovative financial solutions that can really help address these barriers and the risk. At the country level, our focus is developing economies in particular, and it works. It takes the form of a call for ideas. We launch the call every year. We get around 100 to 200 submissions, and then we narrow down to a few of those, and we run through the year an in-depth analysis that aims at strengthening the financial proposals of these innovative ideas, and then assess their impact. Then finally, the last challenge I wanted to mention is about transparent and lack of transparent and partial information regarding the action that financial actors are adopting. We have heard certainly of several initiatives, coalitions that are being built or kicking off for different financial actor groups in the last months. We also very well aware that a lot of efforts by consultants or third-party entities to track the efforts that organizations are investing, so track the action that are put into place. However, the information has so far been scattered. It tends to focus on specific actor groups rather than the whole financial sector at the time, and tends to focus on specific action items. So what is missing is a standardized and comprehensive overview of what different actors are doing in the place, which is able to tell us whether any of the commitments that are being adopted is actually followed on through actions. And what is also missing is understanding the link between the actions that actors can take, financial actors can take and implement, and how they can impact the real economy through the form of investment, for example, in new physical assets, which are low impact and replace high impact physical assets. And in this case, I think quickly mentioned that CPI has been developing a net zero finance tracker dashboard, which really aims at, it works like I said, sort of a metadata effort, which really relies on the different efforts that I was mentioning before, progress from coalition, progress from entities that are collecting and mapping the data and trying to map it along a framework that then will tell us in a single place what is the action that institutions are implementing at the strategic level, the action at the operational level, how they're incorporating goals into day-to-day operations, due diligence, and so on, and then finally how these goals translate into allocation of capital downstream this flow. So this is my 10 minutes introduction. Hope I was in time.
Okay, thank you very much. So I think we get a quick overview of both the financial challenge there and the requirement for the different types of enabling frameworks and the actions that are going to be required to deliver this. And maybe we'll come back to who pays or whatever. I've just lost the mic there a minute, but that's okay if they've switched it to A. Do you have it?
Oh, nice, this one.
Ah, that's okay.
I'll have that one. Thank you. Oh, thank you very much. Shall I introduce myself? It's okay. Thank you very much. So my name is Ece Özdemiroğlu. I'm an environmental economist. I wear 3 hats that I think all relevant here today. One is that I'm founder of FTEC, Economics for the Environment Consultancy. Second is I'm a member of UK Climate Change Committee. And third is just only very recently been appointed to the Environment Council for the First Minister of Scotland. So particularly interested to be in Glasgow for that, but also I'm married to a Glaswegian who grew up around the corner, so he's very excited that I'm here. So I wanted to tell you a little bit about environmental economics, really, especially since we had an opening of that. You hadn't thought about environmental topics. And also the work of the Climate Change Committee in terms of climate change risks and how adaptation and mitigation policies should be thought of as one, really. And third is that some observations that I have gained over the years about how we should learn economics and how we should practice economics to be more helpful for the environmental cause. So I am from Turkey originally, and hence the name. I came to London to study environmental economics and set up FTEC about a month after Rio Earth Summit, the first ever COP. And that was inspirational for my generation of environmental economists. The reason I chose environmental economics is because I thought economics is the study of what makes people happier, not just what makes people richer or what increases GDP, but what increases well-being. And of course, living in a safe, clean environment, a safe society in which you feel a belonging to, having healthy body, healthy mind are all part of what makes people happier, therefore should all be part of economics discipline. The name of FTEC is Economics for the Environment, and that's what we're trying to do. Most of our first 15 years of work spent on working for public policy, a lot of it for the Government Economic Service across the UK. And most of that time we spent on trying to prove that environmental resources did have economic value beyond what we buy and sell in the markets. And externalities, those of you who are studying economics know the term, but things that are happening outside the market are just as important, and it really is time we internalize them, we reflect them, the costs in the price, but also acknowledge the benefits. More in the last 10, 15 years, we now work for private sector. For front-running private sector companies are generally regulated utilities or agriculture forestry companies, all very relevant sectors for Scotland. And in the last year or so is investors. So investors are very much interested, looking for opportunities to invest perhaps for net zero, also to invest to reduce climate risks to their assets. Climate risk used to be interpreted by finance sector as how much they would have to pay to emit carbon. If carbon policy changed and they would have to pay a tax, how much it would cost them to carry on doing the business that they were doing. Now climate change risk means the kind of things Valerio mentioned, but it risks on infrastructure, hurricanes, and everything else that we're reading in the news and experiencing ourselves. So there's a huge shift in our market, huge shift in who is involved in the policy. When you come to Climate Change Committee, the committee is set up by Climate Change Act 2008. It's a statutory independent committee that gives advice to government but also scrutinizes government. On the mitigation side, it sets carbon budgets for UK. In the adaptation side, where I sit, it publishes climate change risk assessments every 5 years, and every 2 years publishes progress report to see how government is doing against their national adaptation plan. When I say government, I mean the UK government, but in the last 2 rounds of progress reporting, Scottish government also asked the committee to do a progress report for how well the Scottish government is doing. The latest risk assessment was out in June this year. There are 61 risks. The news is that almost all the risks are getting worse compared to 5 years ago. The top groupings of 6, 7 risks, the top 4 are related to natural environments. So risks to terrestrial and freshwater species and habitats, risk to soil quality, risks to natural carbon sources like peatland and trees, including spread of pests and diseases, but also soil erosion. Soils hold more carbon than trees that we can plant. We don't want to lose our existing stores. We of course want to capture more carbon and reduce emissions to reach net zero, but we certainly don't want to lose our existing stores. Risks on crops and livestock yields, risks to supply chains, domestic and international. You know, a chip factory in Thailand gets flooded. We don't get computers here. That's a case study in the report. Risks to electrification. I don't know if anyone tried to come to Glasgow on Sunday, but trains were in chaos. Why? Because, I don't know, train companies might be using this as an excuse, but there was a storm, tree fell on overhead cables, we couldn't get to Glasgow. Now, we're trying to electrify infrastructure, transport, as you said, that's the next net zero target. If we don't take climate change risks into account in that electrification, we're going to have new problems. We're also not going to meet net zero. Finally, human health, housing, effect on heat and temperature on health, but I think some of that Ken will talk to us about. What does all this mean for net zero? It means that net zero fix is not a technological fix, it's a behavioral, social fix, and it's also investing in nature. And one of the first thing I would say, the way we do economics, is we change our language. The money we spend on nature is not expenditure, is not spending, it's investment, because you're investing in natural capital that will keep on giving and that will support all our economic activity, but it won't if we continue not maintaining it. And the same with social capital, same with human capital. If we don't invest in these capitals just as much as we're investing in manufactured capital, which is where the main finance is going, they're going to come back and bite us even more. Do I have time or shall I stop there? Who knows? Another couple of minutes. So just very briefly, what does this mean for how economists do economics? Language one I mentioned, let's not forget there is life beyond markets. This is not a problem that will be fixed by markets alone. Climate change is the ultimate market failure, I think. But doesn't mean the public sector will fix it alone. We have to all fix it together, whoever we are, whichever policy we are in charge of. We need to collaborate, we need to work together. Economists, I think, have a very important role of being bridge makers, bridge builders, because we speak to lots of policymakers. Loads of environmental science data comes through me. I put it in an economic framework and an accounting framework, and I present it to my policymakers. If I don't understand it, the policymakers, decision makers won't understand it. So I have a very big responsibility as an economist to understand everything. And there is role for state. Pareto efficiency, let's forget about Pareto efficiency. It's not enough to say total benefits greater than total cost, let's do this policy. We have to know about the distributional effects. Green Book, we've been trying to refresh it to have more distributional analysis, lower discount rates. These sound like, you know, nerdy things about economics, but they have enormous implications for policy in practice. And final point, let's talk about multiple benefits from investment, not carbon and co-benefits, not mitigation and adaptation subcommittee. It was a subcommittee when I joined. Who wants to be in a subcommittee? It has to be a committee, right? So these things, let's change our language. Let's give each side of the policy-making sphere the equal importance that they deserve, and of course give money in it as well, but we'll talk about it in the panel. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. I think just let my...
It's working.
Why don't you introduce yourself, Kenneth, and then start?
Okay, that's no problem, Gary. So my name's Ken Gibb. I'm the director of the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence, which is based at the University of Glasgow. And in my contribution, I'm going to talk about the net zero research that we are doing, which is almost exclusively microeconomic, I suppose, in focus and much perhaps more concrete than some of the broader concepts and ideas we've talked about so far. Before I get into what I'm going to talk about, I'll just say a little bit about this Centre for Housing Evidence that we're involved in. It looks at evidence around housing policy and practice across the UK, drawing on multidisciplinary research expertise from social sciences and the humanities, including the economic sphere, which is what I'm going to talk about. We have a strong knowledge exchange and knowledge mobilization ethos that runs through everything we do, so it's great to be here to talk about this stuff. So housing, I would argue, is very relevant to the challenges of reducing carbon emissions. About 20% of those emissions are directly attributable to our housing. We can really divide the challenge into two parts. One is trying to raise the standards of new housing so that new housing supply has lower carbon emissions and can move towards net zero through passive house and things like that. But also the fact remains that actually the great majority of the housing issue is about our existing housing stock. Scottish Government have shown us that in 2045, about 80% of the housing that will be in existence then is already in existence. So we have a major problem tackling the existing housing stock, some of which, as I'm going to talk about, is very old and very challenging. So I'm really interested in economic questions about how do we produce the smartest, best interventions to improve our existing housing stock? How do we incentivize people? How do we eliminate some of the problems that might emerge from that? And going beyond carbon emissions, as was just said, issues about fuel poverty and affordable warmth and things like that are also very important. So I'm going to focus on 3 areas of work that we're currently doing. These are all live current projects. The first of these is an EPSRC project which has literally just begun, which is a collaboration between us and the School of Engineering at Glasgow, and it's about trying to develop a more flexible air source heat pump for domestic use. That's what the engineers are really doing. What we're doing is more of a kind of industrial organisation exercise where we're trying to work out what needs to be done to promote the air source heat pump industry so that it's scalable and it can achieve the kinds of targets of production, consumption, maintenance, etc. that are required. So we're interested in scalability, we're interested in the barriers to the growth of the sector and how you might go about challenging that. What is the role of kind of socio-technical issues around how innovation is spread, what role the state has, what role other actors have in trying to do that. We've just begun that project. Secondly, as I guess many of the people in the audience are all too aware, the private rented sector has grown massively in the UK and has become a really important part of the housing system. One of the interesting interventions that the government has made across the UK is to set mandatory EPC standards for the private rented sector. So in future years, they will have to achieve a minimum EPC standard. If they don't, landlords won't be able to let and they'll face fines. So there's a really important and interesting set of questions about what are the ramifications for the private rented sector of that. Will landlords bail out? Will they accept the split incentive where tenants benefit and landlords don't until they make a capital gain? What happens to the rest of the housing system? Will there be more opportunities for first-time buyers as a result of that? These policies aren't neutral, that's the point. They have ramifications elsewhere. Finally, I want to talk about the project that I'm most kind of involved in at the moment, which is about a deep retrofit of a single tenement, traditional pre-1919 Glasgow tenement in Glasgow. It's on the south side. It's an evaluation we're doing for the Scottish Funding Council. We're working in partnership with a housing association. It's got the Southside Housing Association, John Gilbert Architects, the Scottish Government, Glasgow City Council, CCG Construction and the University of Strathclyde. And what we're trying to do is we're looking at an empty property of 8 one-bedroom flats in Nidri Road, if you know that, in Strathbungo near Pollokshaws Road. That was transferred to this housing association, and they were going to do a basic refurbishment of it to make it able to let, basically, for a social tenant. And when we got talking to them about possibly doing a deeper retrofit, the evaluation that was funded by the Scottish Funding Council actually enabled more funding from the Council and from the Scottish Government to create an ENERFIT retrofit. So ENERFIT is essentially the closest to passive house that existing housing can get. And we're talking about a property built in the 1890s with sandstone, emits huge amounts of carbon. It's very windy and drafty, got all sorts of problems. So the plan is to make it completely airtight, to use mechanical ventilation, make a whole set of fabric first changes to it, which will essentially mean that if the resident uses the property as it's designed, the fuel costs should fall to only about 15% of what they currently are. So it's a really huge change in the affordability and the fuel poverty dimension of what's possible. So what we are doing is we are looking at the politics of the decision-making processes as we do something which has never been done before in Glasgow. So the planning system has to move with us, as it were, to be able to enable some of these things. We're doing a cost-benefit analysis, we're doing a building performance analysis, and we're doing an occupancy analysis of the tenants once they move in. So this is also live, it's happening right now. The site is a building site just now. If you're interested in this project, there's a video that you can see, a 15-minute film that we've made about it, which you can access on Google. If you just type in housing evidence, you'll find the film. Features me in it, which is maybe a reason not to watch it, but it's still quite an interesting thing. So just to finish, if that's okay, Gary, I'd just like to say a few words about the cost-benefit analysis. This is also work that's going on right now, so I can't give you the answers, but I can give you the sort of provisional direction of travel that seems to be going in. We had to find some counterfactuals. You have to take the project, this deep NFIT retrofit, and compare it with something that's a realistic alternative. So our realistic alternatives are to demolish the block and build something new, similar to it, or to just have the basic refurbishment. You won't be surprised from an environmental economics point of view that the embodied cost of the carbon really rules out the new build as an alternative. So we're really comparing it with the lower level refurb. And it's true that the NFIT retrofit is expensive. That's why it hasn't been done before. It costs about £25,000 to £30,000 per unit. But the benefits are massive alongside it. I mean, in particular, these fuel cost savings for the residents who live in it. We've been able to estimate the carbon reduction costs as well of the property. We've done it on a sort of green book basis. But once we weight it, and as you were just saying about distributional consequences, once you weight it for distribution and take account that these are going to be low to middle income tenants living in these properties, then it has a much more positive effect. The other thing is, of course, that the refurbishment property will almost inevitably have future capital costs because it's so far away from net zero, it's so far away from the kind of targets that society will expect of the building. So there's arguably much more costs to follow over the life cycle of these units as well. So it's a really interesting piece of work. We found it really, really exciting. So it's also really important, finally, for Glasgow. Glasgow is a city of tenements. There are something like 76,000 tenement flats across the city, which are pre-1919. It's about a fifth of all the housing in Glasgow. And Edinburgh is similar in having a large tenement stock. So we need to solve this because we can't lose these kinds of properties, which are so important to our communities and our neighbourhood ways of life. So we hope to report on that research, hopefully in June or July, but we'll be doing more stuff before then. Thank you.
Sorry, take it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. That was excellent. So we've had 3 contributions. Okay, so we've had 3 contributions. I think Ken's really interested and kind of gave us a bottom-up about how transformational it needs to be, looking at a particular big issue in Scotland and elsewhere about how we kind of change our heating, energy efficiency within homes. AJ really challenges, I think, on the environment in terms of economics and the contribution of economics in thinking about the environment, climate risk and that whole thing about whole system change. And Valerie really around the extent, I think the numbers are quite mind-boggling in the context where people understand the extent of finance that will need to flow in that transformation. So there's a lot beyond economics in this, but I think there's a lot of real interesting things to change. So we've got an opportunity now for questions. Obviously, we're in the midst of COP at the minute. We've got a number of major challenges globally, and I think we've just touched on a number of issues really that kind of intersect with this. This panel's about policy and really how we do policy better in the context of driving that change. AJ mentioned the Green Book, which is used in terms of how we design interventions. It's almost the manual for government interventions in the economy, how that needs to change. In Scotland, we've got a big focus on the just transition to net zero. So who pays? How do we do this in a way that allows or mitigates the negative impacts on certain sectors of the economy? But in Ken's example there, you've heard about how a transformational change can actually help reduce social inequalities related to fuel poverty, changing the quality of existence or whatever. So there's loads in the economics. So I'll come maybe to the floor first if anyone wants to come to any speakers. If you just put up your hand, yep, we've got one at the front, 1, 2, 3. If you come to the person at the front, please, and if you just say your name and then your question, we'll put it to the panel. Just keep coming, sorry, this, yeah. So we'll take the two on this side and then we'll go to the two on the other side. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Christian Shawijaya, and I'm a Master of Science student from the Financial Economics in the University of Glasgow. And my question is relating to the funding and also relating to the how to fund the improvement and also the reducing of our carbon. And relating to that, most of the biggest polluters who are currently doing the most is the developing economy. And currently, some of them are trying to raise funds through green bonds. And one of them is Indonesia. From his speech, the president said for COP26 that he implicitly suggests that the nation needs funding. 41% of the carbon reduction will be funded through foreign funding, and 29% will be funded through their own national budget. As a panel who consists of economists who work in the public sector, what do you think are the most important things to consider for governments for developing nations when issuing those green bonds? And are there any other financial vehicles or other incentives to fund environmental projects of developing economies? That is all from me. Thank you.
Okay, so that's a question on green bonds and finance. Will we take one other question and then I'll put those to the panel? Just that one behind.
Hi, thank you very much for those remarks. That was very interesting. I'm Frank Brocek. I'm an economist in the Constitution Group in the Cabinet Office in the UK government. And my question was relating environmental policy and devolution. So more specifically, what are your thoughts on the specific policy levers and areas which kind of policy can deliver better on if they are devolved? And what are, in your opinion, areas where perhaps it's better to legislate and kind of use those policy levers to tackle climate change on a higher level, for example, at the UK level? Thank you.
Okay, thanks. So I'll maybe come to Valerie first on the green bonds and then to AJ and Ken on the kind of policy response, if that's okay.
I'm not sure about that, but yeah.
Yeah, so on the green bonds, I think that's a great question. We did a research where we looked at the green recovery, right? So the green recovery has been like a big chance that we had in front of us to actually respond to crisis. Okay, this was a great opportunity that for many days have been discussed about like using the possibility to respond to the crisis as a way to actually shift our investment patterns and push towards a green transition more boldly. Many reports highlight the fact that this is not the case. Actually, the response has been much lower than it was expected. So certainly there are a different set of instruments that can be explored to re-put the discussion into this track. You mentioned the green bonds. I think this is a good point. We've been looking into potential instruments that actually enable the green recovery of developing economies. Now, green bonds is a growing market, but it's particularly for corporate bonds. What we've been observing is that so far sovereign green bonds represent only a small share. It's around like 5% of the market itself, and this is definitely a sector where there is important, definitely growing demand from investors themselves. So it's an opportunity to catch that the developing countries in particular can catch. This means like the use of proceeds and then can be invested into low carbon climate resilient transition. But there are also other instruments on top of green bonds. There is a discourse to introduce, I think they're called fossil fuel subsidy reform bonds. the work is slightly different. Instead of driving change through investment in low carbon, in this case, the loan is conditional to the approval of subsidy reforms. The good part of it is that by reducing subsidies, you free capital then can be used to pay back the loan itself. So it has an impact to improve to an extent the creditworthiness as well as of the sovereign that received this financing. And then there was another instrument that we looked into, which was a debt to climate swap, which is very similar to debt to nature swap. These are instruments for which like a debt basically is forgiven in exchange of having the debt service. Instead of having this financing used to be paying back the debt service, this is being used to invest in low carbon or nature-based solutions. So the idea will be like to incentivize this one. The lender country and the lending country would forgive the loan and exchange this capital would be then used to be invested into green growth. Yeah, I hope this answers your question.
So we'll come along to AJ now.
Yeah, I think this is working, yeah. So the second question is a tough one. It's beyond my understanding of devolution, to be honest, but it reminded me of the subsidiarity principle of European Union. You know, you do things that are cost effective and efficient at the levels that they are. But I think an answer to both questions is to agree on the principles. We need acknowledgement from all policymakers at all levels that there are multiple returns to investing in nature, whether it be climate bonds or debt for nature swaps, whatever the mechanism. And at all levels of government, those returns need to be recognized so that they're valued by private investors. So it's going to be the financial returns, but it's also going to be by investing through the bonds or any other mechanism, you're going to save some money for someone in the future. It could be future renovation of the house, for example, and you're going to generate welfare. If the policymakers don't acknowledge these as valuable returns, then private investment won't invest in them. So that appeals to all levels, I think. A bit of a cop-out answer, but that's the best I can do.
Okay, Ken?
Yeah, so what I would say is I'll give you a concrete example of something which I think has a broader truth to it. So Glasgow City Region, which is a kind of metropolitan regional city deal arrangement in this part of the world, has as part of its COVID economic recovery plan a programme of work that it's setting up to try to use retrofit of the housing stock of 400,000 homes in the area as a mechanism to try to recover the economy, regrow the economy. But when they look at what they're going to do, they have to decide what principles, what are the objectives we've got, what are the best smart mechanisms to do that, which are good value for public money, etc. And then they've got to say, well, in the environment of a devolved nation, what's the best way to balance the funds from locally, from Scotland, from the UK government? And it will depend on the arrangements, and it will depend on the pace at which policy is evolving in both parts of the world. So I think it's completely contingent on both the policy framework that exists and actually the kind of fiscal rules that apply, and that's not something that's permanent. It changes, and it's probably going to change in the near future, isn't it? So I think you've got to be contingent and pragmatic about it, and use the resources that are available to you in the best way you can, provided they're smart policies that meet the kind of objectives and incentivise things the way you want to do.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll go to a couple of questions on this side. And I suppose just to add, another example is maybe the Clyde mission, which is where you've got a focus on a particular objective to redo the kind of the area around the Clyde. I think it's up to about 400 metres from the Clyde on either side, a lot of derelict land. And you focus the mission, then funding comes from multilateral levels of government, private sector and other kind of contributors. So okay, we'll come to questions on that side, thanks.
Okay, many thanks. Matthew Hannon from Strathclyde Business School. So a really fascinating discussion, and Ken's point about the tenement blocks in Glasgow and Edinburgh representing a fifth of all households is a real and pernicious issue really for us to solve. I myself am involved in this space with research and walking the roads in and around Shawlands and Govanhill yesterday. I was struck and to be frank, felt queasy about the scale of the challenge that we have. And we couple this with the discussion and the framing from government that we'll let the market decide and solve these issues. But as your esteemed colleagues on the panel pointed out, this is a market failure. So in the context of household retrofit, can we rely on the market to fix this? And if we can't, what do we need to do to solve the problem? Because, put it this way, households haven't done it yet, and the cost of energy, whilst escalating, is arguably too low to encourage many to make the changes they need to for net zero and beyond. Thank you.
Okay, I think there was one more question on that side, was it? Yeah. Okay, we'll take that question. It's a massive challenge. So essentially, how can we fix the problem of housing in Scotland? I'll start with Ken, and then I'll come to AJ, and I may throw a tuppence worth in that one as well.
I'm not brave enough to solve all the housing problems in Scotland, but I think the tenement one is fascinating. It's such an iconic part of our urban fabric. It's so important, so many thousands and thousands of people. It works on a neighbourhood and spatial level, but it's decaying, it's depreciating, and it's deteriorating in front of our eyes, let alone making it fit for net zero or whatever else. And it is a market failure, and it's a market failure in several respects, and this is something that comes round every 25 years or so with our older tenements. But actually, it's more fundamental than that, and I think the big challenge is that it's owned by lots of different kinds of people. There are social landlords, private landlords, and of course, the majority of which are owned by owner-occupiers. And they are all individual decision takers or non-decision takers in that light. And actually, I think what we need to do is undertake what the Scottish Parliament said 4 years ago, which is go through a thoroughgoing tenement law reform. That's actually a necessary condition. So create condominium-type ownership associations, create sinking funds, which are as mandatory as they can be, and have statutory regular inspections of the common parts of properties. It's only once people have got a common stake in their tenement close that for multiple ownership of it, there's going to be any chance of making the kinds of progress that we need to make. Our project is really easy. It's an empty block of flats at the end of the day. There are no issues about who pays for what or anything like that. That's a huge challenge, but that's the starting point. And that's why it's going to take 20 years at least to actually work, I think.
It might be, sorry, just to throw in an idea, not a solution, but it might be an idea to think about markets here differently. So the market is not, say, in the housing, but market is in the fuel cost savings that Ken was talking about. So you said 85% fuel cost saving. So if public money is not enough to, or individual tenants or landlords' money is not enough to make the initial layout of investment, is it possible to find a private funder for the capital cost who gets a bit of share of that 85% fuel saving as return to their investment? There is at least one fund I know on building renovation, but it's more for commercial buildings. And the return is a mixture of sale of the building, but also occupancy savings. Now, who is the authority that needs to recognize this 85% fuel saving as an economic saving? It's that authority's job to do the policy and leadership to create a new market, essentially. You might find actually public money is cheaper to deploy than private investment, but it is a possibility. We're not yet thinking about markets like that, and I think we need to think about as entrepreneurs when we're thinking about, you're from business school, rather than analysts, economists perhaps, but do deals with social objectives in mind.
That's the right one. Now I can also add to this question that Matthew asked, maybe with an example. It doesn't directly apply to the housing market, but it's related in the sense that has to do with energy efficiency, which is most of the largest problem we have with improving and addressing the carbon intensity of buildings in cities. So like an example of, you were asking about example of market-based approaches, no? You've been mentioning one which is basically Hello? Okay. Sharing the gains that can be obtained through energy savings, and this is called, I think, energy savings companies. Now, were the actors that were actually proposing projects and then sharing some of the benefits economic benefits coming from the reduced consumptions. Another example of an instrument that we've been reviewed and under the Global Innovation Lab for climate finance, we have also more specific instruments for buildings, which I invite you to look, but the one I remember now is about energy efficiency equipment. So basically, in that sense, that innovative financial solutions was basically an insurance that will cover the underperformance of energy efficient equipment with the purpose of creating trust in the market that energy efficient solution can bring benefits they promise on. So this was a solution that was targeted to markets that were originally skeptical over the ability of these technologies to work, to bring the benefits they promise. It is always difficult to sell the idea that, oh, you are going to have, by not paying more, you're going to get a gain, right? Because it's not direct cash we're talking about. So the mechanism was really working as a multi-layer way to share the risk. You would have an initial part of the underperformance risk for the equipment being borne by the technology solution provider, which will have then some skin in the game in case the technology would underperform. And then in case of higher levels of underperformance, that portion would then be covered by an insurance. So this was clearly a type of idea that would then set the basis for creating a market, in this case, an insurance market for the coverage of underperformance risk of these technologies. But in order to enable this, we need help from a specific institution. You don't create a market from a day to another. And in that specific context, the idea was to have a third-party entity at the beginning, publicly funded, that would act as third-party verifier of whether the promised emission reductions are being obtained or not. And if not, it will determine whether a payment needs to happen.
Thank you very much. Now we've got some questions online, which I'll take now, and then we will kind of wrap up this first panel.
Two questions I'll just project until the mic catches up. The first one is, should countries like the UK favour spending money on more cost-effective reductions in developing countries rather than reductions designed to hit domestic emissions targets? And not unrelatedly, what do the panel think is the role of environmental taxes as an efficient tool to reach net zero?
Okay, Stuart, two great questions. So we've got one on the role of environmental taxes to drive net zero, and one on where the UK should spend domestically or internationally. So I'll maybe come to AJ first on the environmental taxes, given the economics of the environment. And we've already talked about externalities and the extent to which we can do more on that front to drive behavioural change, maybe.
I mean, I think the theory is that we make bad behaviour more costly. And when we do it, then people will behave badly less because it's more costly to behave badly. That's our assumption, isn't it? The basic assumption. Or you can encourage good behavior. So we're creating markets, we're creating sort of carrots, support, subsidies, law, regulations to encourage good behavior. There is, of course, analytics that you can do in each context, whether a tax option is better or a carrot option, a subsidy option is better. I don't think, to my knowledge, that you can conclude one is always better than other in a given context. It requires cultural fit. It requires financial and social implications, direct costs of policy, indirect costs of policy. We know how to take all those into account. It also requires a social conversation about why an environmental tax is necessary. But that's just a means to an end. It requires a social conversation about the objectives. So if you're talking about environmental tax for delivering net zero, or an environmental tax for delivering better environmental quality, protecting biodiversity, we need to agree first that these are social goals that we're all signing up to. And then perhaps it's an easier conversation to have how we deliver those goals. And it's just as much about politics as it is about economic analysis.
Okay. Kenya.
I just wanted to talk a little bit about a paper I read recently by a colleague at the LSE, Paul Cheshire, who has suggested a reform of local taxation and stamp duty, which would combine the two taxes into one, which would be administered at a local government level and would be an annual tax as opposed to a transactions tax like stamp duty or LBTT is. And it's quite attractive in a number of respects. It changes the distribution of taxation massively. But he also suggested in it that there should be an environmental offset to it, so that if your property, say, was C or better in EPC standards, you'd get a discount, and if it was D or worse, you'd get an extra tax penalty, as it were. But he did recognise that that's going to be regressive, that often it's people in lower incomes or in poor property market areas would end up paying more than that. So you'd need to have other offsets to your offset. You need to compensate people in some way. So quite quickly it gets quite complicated. And I suppose the broader point is that I tend to think of these environmental taxes in a housing sense as a whole set of policy options, rather than there's not one magic tax or silver bullet or anything like that. There must be loads of different ones. And that's just in my sector. There's lots of sectors to think about. So it gets quite complex quite fast, I suppose.
Okay, thanks. And we'll come to Valerie for a comment on maybe the second question or both.
Yeah, just to continue on the taxes. So I've been mentioning also before, carbon taxes is a way to internalize, of course, an externality cost. And correctly was said that, of course, you need to be sold also politically. A tax is always perceived as a negative, as a monster when it's showed off to people. One interesting thing I wanted to mention there is that in the context of the transition of the financial sector towards a Paris-aligned world or net zero world, I think carbon prices, internal carbon prices, is a thing. It's considered one of the tools that these organizations are increasingly adopting to drive their own investment decision making whenever they do the investment due diligence. So without that being officially approved, it is already being understood as an instrument, at least by a specific actor, in this case financial actors, that can lead to change. Having said that, not all of them are yet adopting it. It's just one of the instruments in the portfolio of options that they have to act towards change, and some of them are already implementing. Regard to the other question on cost efficiency, the opportunity to reduce emissions elsewhere, I think this is a discussion regarding very much like carbon offsets, right? So we're talking about this. We don't have an official position, a CPI on that, but there is plenty of discussion on that, on the opportunity to use carbon offsets. Have been in the past also criticized a lot for the fact that they can lead to double counting, or also on the methodology that have been used to estimate the emission reductions that they lead. So there are two ways to fix this, okay, and build trust into this type of solutions. One, as been mentioned, was about making sure that offset and climate solutions are being implemented as close as possible to the physical assets whose emissions we are trying to mitigate, avoiding as much as possible cross-sectoral interferences. The reason being that if you reduce your emission as a coal plant by building a forest, you create the potential for double counting, because these emissions reduction happens in two different sectors, but one is being used in another sector. There's a risk to count it twice towards the goal. So the idea was really to make sure that it's as local as possible. So if you're a coal plant, again, go for carbon capture and storage, or go for early retirement of the plant, strategies or for supply side energy efficiency solutions. Another how you say, theory, let's call it like this, is about instead, because we are talking about net zero, then we need to account for what other sector can bring in terms of emission mitigations to help sectors which are traditionally more high intensive. However, which is already what's happening in some of these carbon markets which already exist. However, in order to get there, increase the reliability of these markets, you should go, in that case, undergo significant reforms, go towards unifying existing carbon markets, standardizing them, increasing the level of transparency of registries that are being used to track emission offset projects, and making sure that this way we are avoiding double counting occurring between different jurisdictions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We will need to close this session now. Sorry, we've overrun by a few minutes. So I'll just, if we can just give a thanks to Valerie, AJ and Ken for such I hope an interesting and thought-provoking discussion. So many issues to resolve. We're going to have a short break and then we're coming back on with the next panel. I don't know if Richard wants to say anything just before we do that. Okay, so thank you everyone, and on to the break. Thank you.
in-person events, people actually listen, in contrast with Zoom calls. Welcome back for our second session. My name is Ramesh Vaitelingam. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Economics Observatory. Let me just give another quick plug for that before we get to our second panel. The Economics Observatory was set up early on in the pandemic. We launched on the 1st of June last year. And the original idea was to answer questions from policymakers and the public about the pandemic and the economy. And we've since broadened from that to look at other big challenges, not least the climate crisis. I hope you've all managed to get a copy of the second issue of our magazine, which comes out every 6 months. The first issue was dedicated to the COVID crisis. The new issue is dedicated to the climate crisis, and that's published today. There are also some complimentary copies lying around, which you are welcome to grab as well, of a fantastic book by our director, Richard Davis, which he didn't mention in his opening remarks, because he's such a modest fellow, but it's a terrific book. And it's called Extreme Economies. One of the extreme economies in it is Glasgow. There's a whole chapter on Glasgow, which I think you might find fascinating to read, given where we are. That's it from me. I'm going to hand over to one of the lead editors of the Economics Observatory, who I think when we put together the original team was the only one I hadn't met before, and he's been an absolutely fantastic contributor to the project. And I'm delighted that he's going to chair our next one, Graham Roy.
Thank you very much, Ramesh, and great to see everyone back for this second part of the session today, where we're going to focus on the road to net zero. So how do we actually get to net zero emissions? And we're delighted we've got a fantastic panel giving you an academic perspective, but also giving you an industry perspective as well. So first up, we have Matthew Agala from University of Cambridge, who will give us his reflections, and then we'll move through the panel, ending up with Christina Piasco and then Stephen Shale and Claire Mack looking at the industry implications for the transition to net zero. So I'm delighted to hand over to you, Matthew, to kick us off.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here, to be back again at the University of Glasgow. I'm beginning to feel this is my second home. My last event just before the first lockdown was here at the Glasgow Economics Society, where I was invited by some of your excellent economics students to come and discuss similar issues to the ones we're going to talk about today. So let's hope that events don't unfold in a similar manner and we don't turn to lockdown next week. It's great to be speaking about economics and climate in Scotland as well. There are so many brilliant Scottish economists. One of them, the late Sir James Mirrlees, became a good friend, and in his Nobel Prize acceptance speech, one of the things that he suggested was that the best thing an economist can do is find a good co-author. Well, I found 5 and married one of them, and the first article that we have written together since then is actually in this copy. So I won't quite call it our first child, but we are delighted to be included in the Economics Observatory's latest edition. I'm going to talk to you a bit about climate finance and what I think that means, why I think some of the early headlines coming out of COP and in the run-up to this COP have missed the point, what I think climate change is going to do to the public finances and to public debt. And I think that will take up my time. So there are multiple different flavors of climate finance, right? There's the sorts of stuff that we think about when the government's going to borrow some money and they're going to invest it in decarbonizing transport or decarbonizing the energy system, and that's all well and good. So there's debt-based climate finance. There's also the private sector. There's equities, there's private finance, and this could be potentially much larger. And then, of course, there is international aid. And this is what the Green Climate Fund, that promise that wealthy countries made to the rest of the world back in 2009 at COP15 in Copenhagen, that by 2020 they would make $100 billion available every single year to support decarbonizing investments and investments in adaptation and resilience in the developing world. So 100 billion a year. We haven't made it. The OECD estimate suggests that we might make it by 2023. It's already taken up a huge amount of the political operating space. It's a football being kicked back and forth that we haven't provided this $100 billion, and that we might not until 2023. But even more than this, the estimates of how much has actually been provided range from about 6 to 20 billion to 86 billion, depending on whether you're using the Indian statistics, whether you're using Oxfam's statistics, or whether you're using the OECD statistics. So how can we have an estimate of 15-ish billion and 86 billion for the same amount? How can this be? Well, there's no clear definition of what constitutes green finance. And that's the crux of the issue here. If the US, for instance, offers a loan to India of $100 million in order to invest in decarbonizing energy, but it's expected to be paid back with an interest of, say, 10%, so that $110 million will eventually leave India's pockets and go into the United States' pockets. India then raises the question, well, who precisely is funding whom? You gave us 100 but took 110, right? So are the loans that are being made available going to count towards the Green Climate Fund, this 100 billion, or not? That's the political challenge that I think we're going to be talking about over the next couple of weeks. But I think that's a misnomer. It's a mistake. When we look at the estimates of how much we're going to need to decarbonize transport, energy, the food system, buildings, all around the world, we're talking 50 to 90 trillion. Those are the sort of the estimates that are out there. $1.5 trillion a year between now and 2035 just for the energy system, and then another for transport. 50 to 90 trillion. Which means that 100 billion, that's at best the decimal point that we might round to. Right? It's not that important. It's tiny. 100 billion is nothing in this discussion. And so when we talk about climate finance and we talk about decarbonizing the global economy, the Green Climate Fund, it's a distraction. And yet somehow the political systems that we've developed and the debates that we have at COPs tend to zero in on this. You're completely missing the point. It's as if I'm trying to go on a diet and I take my plate of macaroni and cheese and fried chicken and tater tots and decide I'm going to start by getting rid of the parsley garnish on the side. This is completely the wrong perspective. So that's my bit on, don't let a $100 billion tail wag a $90 trillion dog. Let's focus on the big ticket items. And for that, we have to acknowledge that there is no path whatsoever to net zero. Not by 2050, 2060, 2070. There is no path to net zero that doesn't involve leveraging massive amounts of private finance. The amount that's available, the amount that's needed, is something that governments cannot do alone. It must mobilize the private finance system. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no role for government. In fact, it might even mean the role for government is even bigger, because government needs to use public finance in order to crowd in those private sector investments. Crucially, what we could do through, for instance, developing green investment banks, developing the right sorts of incentives to provide a little bit of public capital that leverages and crowds in a huge amount of private finance, that's really, as far as I can tell, the only way that we have any hope of getting there. And the final thing that I wanted to talk about, I think I've got 2 minutes, is on the data, on what do we think that climate science can tell us about the financial world? We know from our climate models that climate change is going to bring storms, temperature volatility, all of these bad things, the floods we've seen on the one hand. So that's what the climate science tells us. And they're all risk-based, right? This is probabilistic stuff. We're talking about risks. Well, there's nobody in the world whose job is more closely tied to the calculation, quantification, and management of risk than the people in the financial world. That's what they do. And yet, what we know about climate risk and what we know about financial risk is that these two worlds have basically never met. And that's a real problem. So one of the pieces of research that we did, this 5 co-authors, one of whom I married, actually tried to split this difference, to actually link them together. So we start with a climate model. We bring into the climate model economic estimates of how each country is going to be affected, how their output will be affected because of the changes in temperature and precipitation that climate model predicts for us. And then we go straight to the financial indicators that are used in the real world. Sovereign credit ratings. We were talking about green bonds, an excellent question earlier. Right? These are financial statistics, financial indicators that are hardwired into the DNA of the financial system. And we adjusted the way that the sovereign credit rating is calculated using S&P's own model to factor in the risks from climate change. And what we showed, within the decade, 63 sovereigns, including the United Kingdom, can expect a downgrade of at least 1 notch. By the end of the century, that rises to 80 sovereigns, facing a downgrade of an average of 2.5 to 3 notches, if we do not invest rapidly in decarbonizing the economy. But if we meet the Paris Agreement, keep warming to below 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 as we can, then we can actually avoid those sovereign downgrades. And that matters because when a sovereign gets downgraded, it increases the cost of debt. It increases the price that governments have to pay to borrow money to invest in things like decarbonizing transport and buildings and energy. What that means, it's going to be cheaper if we invest wide and deep now. Dithering and delaying is only going to raise the price tag. I think that's my time.
Great. Thank you, Matthew. And I guess it's a really provocative talk today around climate finance. Today's a day. So it'll be interesting to see when we get away from here if anything has been agreed. So hopefully there's some good questions that come on the back of that. Delighted now to hand over to Dr. Cristina Penasco from the University of Cambridge, an expert in governance and politics around environment, energy and climate change, and delighted to hear your remarks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the invitation to the Economics Observatory, to the Glasgow University. And like Matthew, it's my first time in Scotland, but I am very happy that Glasgow has received me as a Spaniard with a little bit of sun. So very, very glad for that. I think for my introductory remarks, I would like to start talking about where we are right now in terms of targets, in terms of targets mostly, where we are going with the negotiations at this stage, and how we want to go, where we need to go. And this is where the role of policy plays an essential role for that, in order to create a win-win, carbon neutral future. So where we are right now, we are seeing the negotiations. They are happening downstairs, literally. More than 190 countries have submitted already nationally determined contributions. There has been, during the last 2 days, a lot of new movements about countries submitting new nationally determined contributions, updating the old ones. Argentina, I think, for example, updated their own ones yesterday. So there is a lot about this. We know that with the nationally determined contributions we have now, we are involving around 80% of the global emissions, but are these still enough, or aren't they? And this is probably where the Climate Green Fund will play a role as well. But well, the targets and the nationally determined contributions are not going, as they are right now, to let us to get this global warming, or to limit global warming to the 2 Celsius degrees by the end of the century. With the current ones, the last advancement, we will be around 2.4 degrees by the end of the century. We are not yet there. So what do we need? Well, we will need a lot of funding, but it's not only that. Apart from having or needing more critical, more stringent targets, we need to establish the policies that will allow us to reach those targets. And this is where we are not yet there. And this is where the role of governments start being important and relevant. And not only, and I will mention, someone asked before about the role of regional or more local jurisdictions. And when I say governments, I don't say only national governments. It's also regional governments and local governments who has to play a role on this. If I can use the analogy of a trip, the target is good, is where we are going. How do we go is the policy. And there are very few countries right now that have actually established a strategy in terms of policy and in terms of policy design. So in order to help with this, we will need effective policies. And when I say effective policies, I'm not only talking about environmental effectiveness, which of course is the core of the goals, of every goal. We are talking about reduction in emissions, we are talking about reduction in energy consumption, more energy efficiency, of course. But we are also talking about technological effectiveness. How do we reduce cost? How do we innovate? How do we get the technologies that are going to lead us to this decarbonization scenario by 2045, 2050, 2070, depending on the country? How are we going to foster our economies in a post-crisis context? Effective policies need to balance the environmental and technological effectiveness at the same time than the distributional and competitiveness issues. And there is a dichotomy here, and there are a lot of trade-offs that we are seeing in the evidence in putting in place policies that allow us to get a win-win solution, both in terms of short-term economic goals and long-term environmental sustainability goals. So as part of the work that I've been doing during the last years, together with Professor Laura Diaz-Anadon and Professor Elena Berdolini, we created this decarbonization policy evaluation tool. It's an open access tool, so I can share the link later on if you are interested in it. And I've talked about that as well in the new ECA magazine, in which we analyze the effects of 10 different policy instruments in different outcomes. And as I say, outcomes again, it's environment, it's technology, it's innovation, it's cost, competitiveness, distribution, and other social outcomes. And what we see, it's very revealing, I could say. So we have a set of 211 different papers that we analyze as a systematic literature review, including all countries around the world. We have more than 700 different evaluations. And if I ask you, and I will ask you please to raise your hands, do you think environmental policies or climate policies have been effective in terms of the environment, have had positive impacts? Can you raise your hand if you think they have had these positive impacts?
Is that for us too?
Yes, for everybody. Positive impacts? Okay. Positive impacts in terms of competitiveness and distribution? Anybody thinks they have had this? Okay, well, you are pretty much aligned with the tool. We have seen environmental positive impacts. When the policies are put in place, we get reductions in energy consumption, we get reductions in GHG emissions, maybe not the ones that we need or as strong as we need them, but we see that. But when we move from the environmental perspective, the technological perspective, to the distribution, inequality issues, competitiveness, the picture changes dramatically. We see a lot of negative effects in certain communities, in certain countries, for certain type of communities, certain income levels, and so on. And we cannot allow us for this to happen, because if we don't get people on board, the policies will not work. There is no political feasibility there. There is going to be a lot of fairness problems, inequality problems, and so on. Does it mean that we have done things badly and that we are in a bad position to actually reach a win-win solution and a net zero future that all need? Well, I would say no, and that's the role, or that is when the design of the policies plays a role. So it's not about which policies we put in place, it's about how we design those policies, in which circumstances, under what criteria. And we see that with a proper design, we can get win-win solutions. We have seen that in the past with feed-in tariffs. There are a lot of negative impacts of feed-in tariffs in order to foster the deployment of technologies. They have worked very well in the deployment of the technologies. They have impacted negatively the consumer, the electricity consumer. How do we do that, or we try to avoid that? Well, stable programs, adaptive feed-in tariffs, flexible designs, but at the very end, it has to be stable and adapted to the technology itself. So we don't foster the companies to pass through the cost to the consumers, for example. And I would like to talk about taxes. Someone has mentioned before taxes. Well, taxes, of course, are at the core of the policy instruments. It's probably the most well-known policy instrument. It's fantastic, but it's not enough, and it generates sometimes these negative effects, above all in rural communities. So the more vulnerable people are the ones that are going to suffer the most if we don't create the incentives or the recycling mechanisms associated to these policies that allows them to compensate the higher costs they will pay for the transition. To finish, because I think I'm running out of time, R&D investments, essential for SMEs. They can create not only innovation, but actually foster competitiveness. And one thing that I would like to mention before I finish about local and regional jurisdictions, green public procurement. This kind of instrument is very important in order to foster communities, above all in a context of the leveling up agenda and all these things, in order to foster communities that are or can be seen as left behind. So there are ways to do it. We have the design, we understand the policy. It's just a matter of political will that we get there. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Christina. And two things that just jumped out from both your remarks and Matthew's remarks there was the importance of policy, but also the importance of the private sector, and the private sector is going to be crucial here, and also technology. So with that in mind, I'm delighted to hand over to Stephen Shield from the Net Zero Technology Centre, which is a centre that is actually trying to help us solve these technology challenges we need to get to net zero. So Stephen, over to you.
Thanks very much, Graham, and thank you to Glasgow University for this event. It's been fantastic so far. I've really enjoyed the first panel as well. There's a couple of things I would like to just, I guess, gain your insight on from the audience here as well as the panel. Well, let me tell you a little bit about myself, first of all. I work for the Net Zero Technology Centre. We're based in Aberdeen. We're funded by both Scottish Government and UK Government. Our remit is to look for technologies that can help reduce emissions and can move us from one energy system to a new energy system for the future, for the 21st century. So that's what we're trying to do. So I spend my time predominantly talking to engineers about economics and policy. And today I'm talking to economists about technology and engineering. So there's a we still on? Yeah, good. There's a nice balance to that. But I would like to pose a few questions, not just for the panel, but for everyone in the audience as well. And I'm fully expecting lots of questions. And I think I don't know what the collective noun is for questions from economists, but I'm sure there must be something. Yes, possibly. So a few questions. I would like to put on the table the subject of energy security. I think it's really important that we address that, and it's part of what we talk about every day, is how do we make sure that the systems that we all know and love and have come to trust and use so much actually continue to work. I would like to talk about a just transition. It's really, really important to keep just transition to the forefront of your mind whenever you're talking about energy, because it has such a massive impact. We're talking about an industry that has, like an oil and gas, for example, it has 70,000 people, direct employment in Scotland. roughly 200,000 plus throughout the rest of the UK, plus all the auxiliary jobs that are associated with that direct employment. Yesterday, for example, the oil and gas industry produced enough power to service 62% of the UK's energy requirements, and the rest was made up from renewables. Now that is obviously something that has to change. But how do we make sure that we do it in a just way? And it's not just about the justice for the workers in that particular industry, it's the justice for you and I and for all the people who suffer fuel poverty as well. Because right now, you could contend that energy is relatively cheap, even though we've gone through a period of time where we've seen some sharp increases in energy costs. But relatively speaking, it is cheap. But it's still, in that environment, we have over 600,000 homes in Scotland alone that suffer fuel poverty. Many of those homes have children, and many of those are older aged people suffering fuel poverty. So that's really important. I think we need to talk about that. And I think we need to talk about, I guess, what you're feeling. You know, when you hear the commentary from politicians and policymakers about the movement to net zero, I was really heartened by your comments, Matthew, about the scale of finance that's required. And I think I would like to hear from the audience as well your thoughts and impressions about exactly what are we facing up to, because it is not an easy problem to solve. We still have to figure out how to solve domestic heating. That's probably one of the biggest things that we have to tackle here in the UK. We still have to figure out how do we solve transportation. We only have in Scotland, I think we've got about 23, 26, maybe 30,000 EVs on the road right now. And I know the Scottish Government are working hard to improve the infrastructure to allow us to be comfortable to switch. But who can afford an EV? The costs of these things are astronomical. And as we adopt and as we continue to adopt, costs will come down, obviously. So those are really important issues. I think from my point of view, I would like to talk about the North Sea Transition Deal, because I don't think that many people will have heard of it. And if you have heard of it, then that's great. But basically, the government and the UK oil and gas industry struck a deal earlier on this year to try and enable that industry to transition. And it's a very comprehensive deal, and it has very strict targets on emissions reductions. So that's really something that we should be speaking about. We should be speaking about licensing of oil fields. I'm sure someone will probably have a question about that. And also we should be speaking about the role of technology. Because one of the previous panel members said that this is not a technology problem, it's more of a whole systems problem. Well, technology is part of the system. And technology is not a neutral thing. Many people have ascribed various emotions to certain technologies, which I find quite interesting. So, for example, let me tell you a little bit about what we're doing, and I'm conscious of time. Are we doing okay for time? Yep. We have 3 core programs in the Net Zero Technology Centre. We're working with technologists to develop technologies to reduce emissions. That's the first thing that we're doing. So we're looking at measurement, monitoring, detection of methane. We're looking at automation and the maintenance of the fabric of our energy system, the integrity of our energy system, because if it breaks, obviously we have leakage. So it's really important that we were able to focus on that. The second thing we're doing, which is really super interesting, is energy systems integration. So this is where we're beginning to talk about the possible future. How do we move a carbon-intense industry into the 21st century? And how do we transition? And transition actually does mean that you move from one thing to another. Yeah. So it's a difficult problem. And in that particular core program, we're looking at things like alternative fuels, the development of diesel replacements, because most of the offshore emissions that we experience right now happen because of diesel engines, diesel turbines. And in the UKCS, we produce around about, just from the production side of things, we produce around about 18 megatons of CO2 per year just from production, which is roughly around about 3% of the UK's CO2 budget per annum. So it is quite substantial. Is this mic on? Yeah, okay. Electrification is hugely important as well. So we're looking at electrification. How do we electrify our entire energy system offshore? And this is one of the things that it's not just about the upstream side of things. We should be thinking about electrifying everything that we possibly can until it doesn't make sense. And then you need an alternative. And that could be molecules. So instead of electrons, you could be using hydrogen molecules, or you could be using chemicals like ammonia, for example. There's other alternatives. We've been working very closely with wave technology, with wind technology, offshore wind. We've been building alliances with technology developers across those different sectors. And that's starting to show some really promising results. And we're very keen on that. So from an offshore wind integration point of view, that's something that we're exploring really heavily. So we're looking at how do we use floating wind to power offshore facilities. And it might not be just for the production of oil and gas and hydrocarbons, because that does sound like a bit of a contradiction in terms, doesn't it? But it could also be for other purposes. It's really important that we line these things up properly. And lastly, I would say from a programming perspective, data and analytics is hugely important, because data and analytics and AI can actually drive emissions reductions. So we're investing in a lot of projects looking at how do we use data better, how do we capture the data, how do we store it, interrogate it, how do we animate the data, and how do we share the data in such a way that people can actually make really good decisions to reduce emissions. So there's a lot there. I'm very conscious that we don't have too much time, but I would want to stop with just going back to the whole system approach. Energy lives at the base of the system. Everything you do, everything we do, we consume energy to live. All of our products. The mammoth task that we have in front of us is how do we ensure that we're able to either adjust to maybe our consumption patterns, at the same time making sure that we have energy enough for our growing population and for your future, for my future, for our grandchildren's future. At the same time, we obviously don't want to cause any harm. So it's really important that we reduce emissions and eventually eliminate emissions and get to a point where we have a sustainable energy system. So I think I'd probably leave it there.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Stephen. And I guess one of the key themes in that is the transition in energy to greater renewables output. So with that, delighted to hand over to our final panellist, Claire Mack, who's the Chief Executive of Scottish Renewables, which is the organisation responsible for supporting and developing Scotland's renewable industry. So Claire, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's great to be here and to be able to speak to you. I obviously come at this from a very kind of Scottish perspective, because that's the companies that I represent, about 265 different companies of all varying sizes, so everything from SSE, who have kind of generation and sort of and Scottish Power, who have retail arms as well, all the way down to sort of sole traders who help support the industry through things like environmental consultancy to support some of the projects that we do. So it's a very varied membership in there, but about 85% of my members generate electricity. And they've, over the last sort of 10, 20 years, largely 20 years, have been working very hard to decarbonise the electricity system here in Scotland, and we now run at about 97.4% of our electricity demand is now met by renewables, and the backbone of that is largely onshore wind, which is one of the older technologies. We also have hydro here in Scotland too, which meets I think about 12% of our energy needs, and that has been rolled out since the 1950s. So it was actually a post-war exercise, and some of those sites are still very much up and running. Huge amount of resiliency in there, but I'll talk a little bit about economics of those kind of things in a minute. And more recently, as Stephen was talking about, offshore wind and looking into the future, floating offshore wind. And offshore wind has very much taken a very fast technological journey, fast economic and technological journey, in that its cost reduction pathway has been very, very quick indeed. And that's the key difference, I guess, between renewables and fossil, is that we're a technology, we're not a fuel. So therefore are not impacted quite so much by sort of price volatility in the same way as a traded kind of commodity would be. We are impacted more by needing to have scale projects to drive that cost reduction for each and every technology that we use, and that happens across the board. That's happening, you know, right now with hydrogen, big conversations about how to drive cost reduction to drive the hydrogen markets, and also more nascent technologies like wave and tidal, like we have here in Scotland. We've got a really strong foothold in the wave and tidal sector, but lots and lots of other countries kind of snapping at our heels. So we are obviously central to the net zero story. We've got really strong commitment from UK government. You know, obviously energy is a reserved power, but there's a lot that we depend upon the Scottish government for, policy-wise as well, in order to get projects rolled out. But thinking about that road to net zero, how that's all going to come about, I was thinking about the policy tools that we've got to look at here. And obviously we've got to the point where we've done the electricity story largely through a mixture of kind of incentivisation and taxation, you know, taxation in the sense that consumers have paid, obviously, for the strides that we've made so far. And obviously we've got, we're a regulated market as well, so we sit in that space too. We work obviously very closely with Ofgem, but that's the set of tools, I guess, that are available to any kind of government if they're trying to do any kind of task, is regulation, taxation and pricing. So something that's becoming really, really you know, interesting as part of the conversations in and around COP is what could happen with carbon taxation. What sort of system might we see, you know, and is it going to be one that's going to include imports and exports and things like that? Is it going to be really true to make sure that everybody's genuinely accountable for their own kind of carbon footprint? And subsidy, of course, which is the kind of carrot end of this rather than the stick of taxation and pricing. But subsidy, increasingly more difficult, you know, particularly now after the pandemic, because we're all in the face of ballooning deficits across the world. But that, again, is where Graham was talking about, is where the private sector perhaps can come in. But an interesting story in terms of renewables. We've seen various flavours of subsidy, each with different kind of pros and cons. We started off with a sort of renewables obligation, which was, you know, before my time, so I can maybe be a bit more blunt about it, but it was very much a kind of demand-led system. So you could pretty much, if you could get planning permission, you could build anything anywhere that you wanted. You would get paid to put that electricity into the system, and that has inefficiencies within it. Of course, you can probably see them yourselves right now, which is that you will have got some sites out there perhaps that are not the most productive sites. They are the ones that, you know, like I say, were enabled by the planning system, and you were able to, you know, somebody who had land as well were able to kind of bring those about, and not necessarily what the electricity market demanded at the time. But we've moved away from that system now. We moved away from that over a course of time to what is now a contracts for difference system, which is effectively a top-up, or was a top-up, I should say, whereby the government would basically subsidise the additional costs of green generation in order to allow it to have that sort of route to market. That's all changed. If you speak to BEIS now, or in my conversations with BEIS now, they quite gleefully tell me about how they managed to get 6 megawatts of electricity generation for free in the last auction, because that's the price point that we are at now, is that renewables have gone below that kind of wholesale market price and are now actually paying back in a number of places. And a lot of that's down to big bang for buck stuff like offshore wind. It really does bring a lot to that. So there's sort of, you get a lot high volume, low cost power out of something like a CFD. What you don't get, what's been quite difficult about that process, is you don't get any positive side effects. And by that I mean you struggle to bring forward things like supply chain benefits, because if you're continually driving a lowest cost of energy option, that is what you will get. So you're not going to be able to get any of the true benefits of something like supply chain growth, because it will automatically become a kind of heat-seeking missile for the cheapest place in the world in which to manufacture goods and technology associated with that. And that's a feature of that CFD system. And the other thing that you need to be quite mindful of with a system like the CFD system is that there are a lot of associated costs with renewable energy projects to do with innovation, technology innovation. That costs money. It needs people to take risks. You also have costs associated with environmental sensitivity. That's a very big feature of renewables projects, is making sure that we develop alongside the environment, because we are reliant on a natural resource. And those costs are becoming more and more complex as we roll out more renewables. And again, if you think about that in the context of a least cost system, are you really going to get the outcome, the positive outcome that you want, which is actually really good coexistence between nature and technology, and people and technology, and innovation and technology, and those are the sort of things that you know, we're starting to see real stresses and strains on that system. And continual conversation with government. Government recognises that, UK government system, they do recognise that, and we have a good conversation with them about it every time we have an auction. But at the moment, quite rightly, I would say, UK government are very firmly focused on what I would say that is the high volume bang for buck, because that's what's going to really, really drive the big strides towards net zero. And then, you know, we're quite clear that something else, you know, will come through afterwards, alongside that CFD thing. But thinking about net zero, it does very much lean towards that kind of taxation, that pricing and regulation sort of point. That kind of polluter pays principle is one of probably the easiest way to understand how you could potentially get to net zero. If you get that in place, you know, you disincentivize what you don't want and you incentivize what you do want. But at the moment we have a pretty much a fairly, you know, a bit of a mess in terms of current carbon initiatives. You know, we've got various different ones running, and we can see that you know, that's impacted perhaps our ability to draw finance and to draw investment into the piece. That has been a struggle. It's one of the reasons why finance is one of the key themes of COP, I would say, is that we're really, it's one of the big things that I guess everybody's hoping will come out of this COP, because it's what will absolutely drive those action plans, is if everybody's very clear and has confidence about the market that they're playing in, and carbon taxation probably does allow for a lot of that to come in. So we have to think about what policy can deliver, and potentially what you need to put additional, existing policy can deliver, and what you might need to put in additional into place in order to reach net zero. And exactly kind of what Stephen was talking about there, which is we're going to have to sort of create new physical and financial infrastructure at a rate that we've just never done before. You know, we know that there is a decade for us to do this, and a decade is not very long in government infrastructure times and in policy times. It's not a very long time at all. So we need to see innovation at all levels, not just in the technology level, but in the policy space as well, delivered at scale and at pace. And particularly, I guess, from the technology space, a lot of the things, there's a potential for smaller modular nuclear, perhaps, if that would be one of the routes that we could go down. We've got to look at the development of a hydrogen market at the moment, not clear what the scale will be. Definitely got a place in the energy mix, but not clear what the scale is, and until you can get a handle on that, quite difficult to work out, how that will grow, and what the economics of that look like. CCUS, of course, as well, again, considered to be non-optional when you go to the Committee on Climate Change reports as to what it will do in the system, because of its key role in heavy industrial decarbonisation. And other newer things, direct air capture, and obviously just big technology improvements across the board to kind of match this completely new energy system that we're working within. So we need EV infrastructure, we need localised grids, we also need big grid to deliver all of our clean energy. We need heat networks and heat pumps as well. Gas grid upgrades potentially, if we're going to bring things like hydrogen into the gas grid. Energy efficiency investment, and that's a really, really key one, because the absolute first principle that we start with for net zero should be that the unused kilowatt hour is the best kilowatt hour, and the way to do that is really by demand suppression, and one of the key ways of doing that is through energy efficiency. And that is about, basically looking at all of our housing stock and a lot of our industrial buildings as well, and making them better to start with, and then from there on in moving into how you do things, because we've got to be very careful with the use of the word net in net zero. Net doesn't give you a hall pass, to do, whatever you want, not reduce any consumption and not reduce demand, and not think about the circular economy. These things have to go together. We simply don't have enough resource within the planet to cope with growing populations, to cope with growth of cities and everything else that we want, that we know are productive for us kind of socially, economically, intellectually, that we need to do. So I think the energy efficiency key is an absolutely key point here. We're also going to need to see digital infrastructure. improved. You know, I came from the telecom sector, I jumped to sectors, and there's a lot of synergies, but there was just an absolute parallel pathway here as well for energy and technology now, particularly digital technology and communications technology, because one of the ways that we will be able to have a much more efficient energy system going forward is a sort of smart grid concept. 5G and the Internet of Things, so different sensors being able to help us track demand and flows and manage those within the new kind of energy system, which is going to be a very different kind of energy system. We've been very used to a sort of big box energy system that just manages the peaks and troughs of you know, by turning itself up or turning itself down. That's a really technical explanation of how thermal has worked in the past, but now you're going to need to be managing flows much more. You'll be managing what's out on the floor a lot more, and managing that with people and consumers who are not generally active within the energy system. You know, even to the point of consumer switching, you don't see active consumer consumption within the energy market, and it's a real problem. But technology can provide a really good interface for people to be involved in the energy system, but it will only, you know, that will only work if we've got the right networks in place for people to be able to do that. So there's a lot of work needed on that kind of practical delivery and implementation point. Graham, I'm really sorry I didn't check when I started, so you'll have to tell me when I'm due to finish. Oh my God, 2 minutes already. Right, so where did I get to? A lot of work needed is on educating and informing the citizen and the consumer as well, and that's a big gap. That's a really big gap at the moment. So basically, sort of rounding up, what will the market not provide, or you know, what might they not provide? Innovation at the right pace and in the right place, right technologies. At the moment, what we actually really desperately need is kind of long duration storage and system tools. Market's not set up at the moment to give us that. Grid, loads of distractions in that space. As far as I can see, you know, it's very hard for me to see a point where from where we are right now and in the next kind of 5-10 years where we could make a mistake with deployment of grid technology and networks technology, particularly in somewhere like Scotland. We've got such an abundance of natural resource. We've got other things coming down the track, like you know, hydrogen production, where actually there is not going to be a slowdown in demand for clean electrons. So any grid investment that we make now is going to be worth it, and we have a real struggle with that anticipatory investment needs cases for new network, which then you know, doesn't deploy, and therefore you don't build the wind farms, or you don't build what you need in terms of you know, wave and tidal or hydro schemes in order to, because the grid isn't there to deliver it. So it all becomes very chicken and egg, but loads of distractions in there because, again, I'll come back to the hydrogen story. Definitely, you know, very positive view of hydrogen, but it shouldn't be a reason for us not to build grid infrastructure upgrades at this particular point in time. I just cannot overemphasize that. Smaller scale technology, also another thing that perhaps the market won't provide until later on. It is very focused, like you see, on getting high volumes through. We did have a feed-in tariff, I think Christina mentioned that. Government, you know, again, have looked at that and have analysed what they got for the money. It was expensive to the consumer. But consumers, there are a lot of consumers who and communities who wanted to own and still want to own their own energy systems, you know, literally empowered communities. So we need to think about how that will work, and also for newer technologies like wave and tidal. Heat is another one that is, you know, you're talking about a technology that at the moment is higher than market, you know, comparisons. So, you know, it is more expensive to fit a heat pump than it is to replace a gas boiler. But we know we need to do it, and there's a really strong economic case behind that because we have got manufacturing capability here in Scotland. It plays very much to some of the key drivers in the Scottish economy. Heat networks are very much civil engineering projects, which really give the Scottish economy a bounce. You know, they have a disproportionate impact on the Scottish economy. So we've got to get that focus on driving investment in power generation and electrification, and that networks infrastructure, again, very much the unsung heroes. People don't see it. Very quick last note on industry relationships with government. It's been quite interesting. The onshore sector is very different to the offshore sector, and those are basically, you know, largely the two kind of key players at the moment, you know, alongside some others. But the onshore sector has tended to work at a very different scale to offshore, quite a highly atomised market. Their relationship with government very different to what the offshore sector have now. The offshore sector are they're large projects, they're big corporates. You know, the next phase of offshore you know, will be even bigger projects, and they've developed a pretty transactional relationship with government. and that they've recognised through things like the industrial strategy and sector deal mechanism that if you offer, you know, all the things that we talked about there that might not be brought forward by the CFD, so if you offer innovation, skills development, supply chain development, you will get, you know, much more certainty from government, and that's exactly what's happened in the offshore market, you know, to give you that kind of 40 gigawatts target that the UK government have offered, which has helped them to mobilise this private finance. It's been a real win-win in that, and we're getting improving clarity over what's sensible and what works in terms of government intervention in the market. We've gone from a discussion, certainly up here in Scotland, of you know, influence and being leaned on to use very specific suppliers within the market to something that's a much higher level now. That recognition that actually this next phase needs government to help us with that mobilising private finance, that bit, and actually them being a bit further back helps that. So that's, you know, things like ports and harbours infrastructure investment. You know, if you look across even recent kind of reports of infrastructure investment, you know, ports and harbours are starting to look, you know, over £100 million packages going in places like Nig, you know, in Leith as well, and various other places. So the government starting to get into the groove and recognising that that higher level role is a good piece. Just transition, also seriously important. People and skills, hugely important. We've got about 22,660 people in the industry just now. We are staring down the face of a doubling of onshore wind and a tenfold increase in offshore wind, which means that, you know, for every gigawatt of electricity that we deploy, we end up with about 1,500 jobs. So we're looking at large scale up in terms of people and skills, and that is something that needs to be managed. I think the great thing about this is, and we've had a lot of discussion through COP panels in the last few days about our last energy transition away from coal. You know, we know what a badly managed energy transition looks like. We're not going to do that again. Very key difference in here, though, is that the industries that were brought in or attracted in, particularly in a Scottish context, at the end of the coal mining years, had very little in terms of synergy, I would argue, with what the actual coal, you know, the mining workforce did in terms of skills. I don't think that any of them really had that longevity that something like renewables has. You know, my industry is working to 20, 30, 40-year plans at the moment. That's the discussions that we're having, and that's what we're working to. I don't think that was ever present when we started to talk, you know, to people like semiconductors manufacturers, for example. And again, that's a product that was always going to be buffeted by sort of global demand and, you know, labour costs. You know, eventually labour costs would be able to overcome any kind of grant or subsidy that was offered in order to bring them here. So I think we are in a very, very different position than we were at that particular point in time. So I'm very hopeful that we are going to be able to enact the just transition as committed to by our governments.
Great. Thank you very much. I'll just stand up here so that I can see people for questions. Thank you very much, Claire. And thanks very much for all four panellists for quite distinct but really challenging and informative talks there, whether it be in climate finance, whether that be issues around the role of the private sector, technology, public policy there. So we've got time for questions. So as before, there'll be a roaming mic coming around and we'll take a couple of questions, and then we'll also go to some questions online as well. So there's a couple of questions on the left-hand side, if we can come to them, and there's a couple of questions there in the middle there. So we'll come to you in the first. Yep, Lucy, if you go to these, we'll go into these ones first.
Hello. Sorry about that. Thank you for that wonderful panel. It was great to hear and hear from all four of you. My question is kind of rolled about the government and the private institutions. So, Dr. Penasco, I really liked your metaphor of, you know, the destination is the goal, but we don't really have a roadmap of how to get there. And Matthew, you mentioned the need for private funding in terms of getting involved in these climate goals. So, do we have any specific examples of countries or specific policies that we can use as examples, you know, as roadmaps to get there? Because as of now, it seems pretty unfeasible to get the private sector involved in the funding of these institutions.
Okay, I'll come to Christina first and then Matthew.
Thank you very much for the question. We have seen effects of crowding in effects from certain policies that has been started or initiated by the government, and then the private sector has followed. I mean, that is very clear for R&D investments. If we provide R&D grants and some kind of R&D subsidies to certain companies, there is evidence suggesting that we won't find crowding out effects. So it's not like the private companies are not going to invest because the public system is giving them the money, but the opposite. There is crowding in effects in which the companies will continue investing if there is this first shot of money coming from the governments. I think it can be the same with, probably Matthew can complement on this, with green investment banks and national state investment banks to provide the stability. So what we have to take very much into consideration when we talk about the private sector is that what the private sector looks for when thinking about investment or foreign direct investments and so on is a stability of the frameworks. If the government can provide that, there is this crowding in and positive effects, and the private sector will follow. But we need the first step with the government. If you
yeah, it's a brilliant question. I'm not sure if I can add much substance beyond what Christina has said, but I would submit that the massive reduction in the cost of solar, wind, and battery technologies that we've seen over the past 10 to 15 years. There's an 85% cost reduction across the three technologies. This is perhaps the most powerful example of government funding providing the initial incentives and the subsidies to start building these technologies, start the R&D, and then seeing the private sector crowd in so that most new installments of wind and solar are actually funded by private sector. I mean, this is pretty exciting progress. On the private sector, purely private sector side, I mean, there are examples of companies that are issuing green bonds in order to develop new technologies. For instance, Anglian Water, where I live in Norwich in East Anglia, has issued green bonds in order to raise finances to build treatment wetlands to treat wastewater, rather than just building more bricks and mortar, high carbon, high energy treatment facilities. And this has been used, you know, this is a good example as well, I think, of governments, of companies, the private sector, raising green finance.
We've got some questions on the left-hand side. Yep.
Thank you. Hiya. So I'm just wondering, in terms of leveraging private finance, is there a trade-off between the long-term effects of cleaning up the global production scheme and the short-term effects of, well, I assume the majority of that private finance would be foreign direct investment, and that strong correlation between FDI and export-led growth? We see this story with China from '78 with the open door policy, mass amounts of foreign direct investment, and then joining the WTO and their led export growth, along with massive increases in carbon emissions.
Right. Matthew, maybe what we'll do is take a second question just quickly while we've got it, while you're thinking of the reply to that.
Thanks. Hi, thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask, somebody mentioned that right now one of the massive advantages of the electricity market is its low price volatility compared to fossil fuels. Do you think in the future, as we have more technologies relying on electricity, that this volatility the volatility of the electricity market will increase or become even more stable than it already is?
Maybe Matthew, if you could maybe pick up on the first question, I guess, to broaden it out, I guess, is the sources of finance. Where are the sources of finance that we could get to fund this? And maybe if I could come to maybe Stephen, maybe on on the second question. And, okay, Matthew.
So on the first question, you've gone beyond economics into the much more realistic but difficult and messy world of political economy. The political economy, the political economies that will govern the way that private finance is provided around the world for decarbonization are going to be at least as complex as they are for non-climate finance. I don't see why going green would make that any simpler. But there are great examples of non-green finance over the past 30 years or so that have developed win-wins in both parts of the world, in the wealthy and the developing part of the world. What matters is the design of the mechanism. And that's problematic whether we're talking about private finance or, as I raised earlier, green loans with lots of strings attached. Mechanism design transcends whether it's private or public.
Great, thank you, Matthew. Maybe, and Stephen and Claire, just on the pricing point, just get your reflections from an industry point of view about how that's driving behaviours. Maybe Stephen first, and then we'll go to the online questions.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's quite a complex one, I think. When we start to kind of unpack it a little bit. Let's take it from another angle. I mean, you mentioned the fossil fuel side of things. So the fossil fuel is a commodity. It's hugely turbulent in terms of pricing. In fact, if you get 10 economists in a room to try and predict the fossil fuel price of an oil barrel, they all kind of fail because it's a really difficult thing to do. What we need to see, though, is the increased growth of wind and renewable technologies taking up the gap in our energy demand, which will grow as well. So we'll see the growth of offshore wind, we'll see the growth of other renewable technologies starting to add to that portfolio of renewable resources. And we might get to a point where hopefully we can see that electricity prices start to stabilize and become a little bit more predictable than the current system that we have today. But I'm not an economist, so I'm not going to say what would work and what wouldn't work in that respect. But all I would say is that the good outcome of growing the renewable sector possibly could be a more stable price regime for energy. And that would be an outcome that I would love to see, because the thing that we need to do when we talk about just transition is not just about industries that are transitioning to a new new way of working in the 21st century and people finding different jobs. It's making sure that the consumers of energy have justice as well, and that we have energy that's affordable and that we have equity in that. So it really is important that we do get that. So I don't know what the answer to your question is. I'm sure the economists have a better response to that, but that would be my hope.
Okay, great. Yep, Claire, do you want to just come quickly?
Yeah, it is quite complex in that at the moment you've got different technologies in the renewable sector that can do different things. So an offshore wind turbine can produce a lot more electrons than a wave and tidal device, for example. So you've got a kind of supply side issue in there. The key thing in here is actually about how the system's set up. That's how you will introduce resilience, and it's how you're going to introduce stability in there. So this is actually one of the most volatile costs we've got at the moment is network charges. They're something that are really unpredictable and geographically disproportionate. Right? So where the best energy sits in this country is actually where you pay the highest cost to move it about, which does not make sense in a net zero market. The other thing that you need to work out here is a cost and price for storage, because that's where you would start to get volatility in the market, is due to intermittency of renewables. So once you've got those two things in place, you've got a stable network charging regime, and you've got a good predictable price for storage and a fair price for storage, then you've got it good. I'm going to leave you with one of the key complexities of the renewable energy market to consider, and it's one that we think about too. I talked about us being a technology rather than a fuel. In a technology space, your marginal cost tends towards zero. And that's a really key issue for the renewable sector to think about, because you can't have electricity going out or producers, generators getting paid nothing because they've got to pick up these kind of network costs. So that's in the round, these things need to be kind of pulled together and solved to create that stability, but it's not impossible. There'll be people like you who will help us do this.
Can I just add one thing to that?
Yeah, well,
as well?
just really quickly, we're able to give one final set of questions from online, if that's okay. So Stuart, could you just get a final question from our online audience, please?
Sure. So I'll pull two together if that's okay, if I can be.
Okay.
But both focusing on the technology question. So the first is asking about whether or not more localized energy sources might well be part of the solution here. So localized water bores, I hope someone knows what that is, and small turbine solar could be a useful tool. Does the panel agree with that? And secondly, do you think decarbonising transport is only a question of technology? You know, what about demand reduction, pricing, spatial planning, active travel, and so on?
Okay, maybe Christina, if I could come to you. You mentioned the kind of local dimension of all of this and the policy aspect. Maybe if I could ask you to pick up that question.
Yeah, I think, in terms of localized sources of energy, this is what we are seeing a lot, more in developing countries. In developing countries, there is a lot of fostering of technologies that work out of the grid and are being fostered by the policy in order to empower different communities and small communities. And this is one of the things that we are seeing, because that gives the communities freedom to not depend on governments that tend to be more corrupt and less stable from an institutional point of view. Regarding the spatial planning and so on, certainly, it is a system. It's not only about technology, it's about behaviors, but it works not only for transport, it works as well for households, and it's very important in the building sector. So I think it's a matter of the two worlds.
Okay, great. Well, I am conscious of time, and we are now just half past, which is when we're due to finish. Could you join me, just first of all, just thanking our panelists with a round of applause? And it leaves me just to, first of all, thank colleagues at the University of Glasgow for hosting us here today, and also colleagues at the Economic Observatory for organising this fantastic event. You can follow more about the Economic Observatory on social media and also economicobservatory.com. Hopefully you get a chance to work your way through the magazine, where there's a series of absolutely fantastic articles. For people online, if you happen to be in the south of the UK, between 17th and 19th of November, please join us at Talk Economics event, where you hear lots of different talks about not just climate issues, but a whole variety of different questions around economics. Can I thank all panelists for joining us today for the fantastic sessions and the great insights? And on that basis, can we just have one final round of applause for all our panelists, and also thank you to you for coming along. Hopefully this may even be your first in-person event post-pandemic, and I can't tell you how much it is great to see people in person. So thank you very much for joining us.